Welcome, everyone. It is so great to be with you for another episode of the People's Podcast. And we got a special episode today because we are going to be speaking with two people who have been really close to everything that has happened in Minneapolis since George Floyd's murder in the past year. And also are going to tell us some of the stories that that have transpired beyond like what the media has covered in kind of the blast of coverage around the uprising following George Floyd's murder and the trial. There's been so much happening. Minneapolis has a really tight-knit activist community of whom two of the major members, I would like to say, are with us today. And so we're so lucky to be joined by Nekima Levy Armstrong. Nekima is a civil rights lawyer in Minneapolis. She is also a racial justice expert and activist, and the former head of the NAACP in Minneapolis, as well as a former mayoral candidate. And in talking about this episode, Nekima, Emma says more than a few people think that the city might be better off now, in fact, if you had won that race. And so it's great to welcome you and to have you with us to talk about this.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have our very own Emma Cerrone, who is a longtime activist involved in probably more things than I can count in Minneapolis and across the country, in whether it's independent media, on-the-ground activism in Minneapolis, and of course, our media and messaging coordinator at the People's Party. Also on the board of Women Against Military Madness, and we met actually by organizing the Women's March on the Pentagon back in 2018 and in 2019, which Emma was on the board of as well. And so, Emma, it's great to have you on too. And everybody gets a treat because normally Emma's behind the camera. You know, she's kind of running the back end of the show. But Emma has just been, she's been in the streets in Minneapolis documenting everything, because one of the many things that Emma does is that she is a fantastic photographer. And if Emma, if you ever decide to run again, Nekima, in fact, you should ask Emma for photos of you, because she showed me some amazing ones of you throughout all of the actions and all of the different events since last year. And so, Emma, amazing to have you to help us kind of like guide us through what is going to be like a unique format for this show. And that is, we're going to be guided through kind of like taken through a photo essay, so to speak, with the photos that Emma has taken and documented, and the actions that Emma and Nekima have been a part of in Minneapolis since the murder of George Floyd, the uprising in Minneapolis that lit the whole country ablaze, and up to the trial, and so many of the family-led events that I've had the privilege of learning about recently that have continued, and so much of what you don't hear about when you just read kind of the mainstream media stories or see that. Because I think, as you put it, Emma, the media just likes it when things are burning. And so, you know, that's where the cameras go. And I think all of us who are involved in activism action learn that pretty quickly. And so it's great to have you both and to be talking about this. And so, you know, Nekima, I think I'll hand it over to you first, and then, you know, Emma, you can kind of take over in carrying us through the story over the past year of Minneapolis and what the activist community and the families have been through there, the families of those who have been killed by police violence, who've been murdered. And so, Nekima, if you want to kind of tell us a bit about maybe some of the backstory in Minneapolis and the community, and particularly the Black community, the activist community in Minneapolis, and how you all work together, you know, and how what it looks like in the city. You can kind of give people an impression of that who haven't been as close to it.
Sure. Well, thank you both for having me on the show, and thanks to everyone who is tuning in tonight to be a part of this conversation. So as you said before, I'm Nekima Levy Armstrong, civil rights attorney and activist here in the Twin Cities. I moved to Minnesota in 2003 when I became a law professor at the University of St. Thomas Law School. And a couple of years into my time at St. Thomas, I started putting down the mainstream newspapers and started picking up the Black newspapers and seeing a completely different story as far as the conditions that Black people were experiencing in the Twin Cities, including policing issues and disparities, criminal justice disparities, education and employment disparities as well. And so all of that piqued my interest in terms of trying to get involved. I started working with an elder in the community named Nathaniel Kalik, who was the president of the St. Paul NAACP at the time. He was also part of the historic Rondo community, which some people know about and some people don't, but Rondo was a thriving Black community in St. Paul, Minnesota. Lots of businesses, Black people owning their homes, having a cultural enclave, and then the government decides to run I-94 freeway right through the heart of the community. And that community has never recovered as a result of what happened. And so back in about 2005, 2006, we started looking at policing issues in the Twin Cities. And I was appalled by some of the stories that I was told, some of the things that I was reading about police harassment and abuse of Black people in the Twin Cities. It's something that people have known about for many years, but it only began to become a part of people's consciousness when we started marching here. And we started marching and demonstrating consistently in the Twin Cities from around the end of November of 2014 up until the present. And we're still going. So we never stopped, which is, I think, one of the things that's important for people to understand when they look at what is now a worldwide movement for racial justice and calling for an end to police violence, that we've been building momentum here for many, many years. Shutting down freeways when we need to try to get the attention of the powers that be. We have gone to the halls of power, whether it be city council in Minneapolis and St. Paul and surrounding suburbs, or to the county commissioners' meetings, or to the state legislature, or even to the governor's house or to his office. As a matter of fact, we went to the office of Governor Tim Walz not too long after he was elected, and we wound up essentially taking over his office. He wouldn't come out to meet with us, and we had a demonstration there. We were demanding that he take seriously the issue of police violence in the state of Minnesota, but he wouldn't meet with us at that time. He wouldn't take this issue seriously. And then months later, what do we see happening? A lynching, essentially, of George Floyd, which occurred on May 25th of 2020. George Floyd was the latest of hundreds of victims since the year 2000, of people who've been killed by police. Most of the police officers who have killed people here have been white men, but not a single one has ever been held accountable until Derek Chauvin's guilty verdict on April 20th. And even now, we still don't know how the judge will sentence him in that case. But at a minimum, he was tried, and as you can see, he was found guilty. That has never happened before in the state of Minnesota for a white man, a white male police officer, to be convicted for killing a Black person. Think about all the people who've been killed along the way, names we know and names that we don't, that have never received justice, have never received any sense of accountability. Most of us don't even know their names. A lot of these things happen when there were no cell phone videos, when there was no body camera footage. And so the names of those individuals, their stories are just kind of floating around, and the only people who are really able to tell those stories and revive those stories are the family members who have the energy to get out there on the front lines and to speak their truth. And so I'm glad that that guilty verdict happened. It happened because of the power of the people, which I can go more into later. But I'm glad that guilty verdict happened. I'm hoping that there is a very strong sentence on the part of the judge, and that those other 3 officers who helped kill George Floyd are also convicted later this summer for what they did.
It is so rare that you get justice when police murder anyone, particularly Black men, Black women, in this country. I believe it's like 1 in 2,000. It's just an incredible conviction rate, you know, incredibly low conviction rate for police, for holding them accountable. Emma, I know that you've prepared a number of different photos from the beginning as you've been documenting everything that's happened since last May. And I wanted to hand it over to you if you wanted to put some of those up from the very start, and where you wanted to start us off.
Sure. Well, I appreciated, well, obviously everything that you said, Nekima, but I first, I think it was maybe 2015, after Jamar Clark was killed, was when I lived near the 4th Precinct. So I was there at the shutdown a lot. And the community here that has, like you said, been marching, been in the streets, been doing things nonstop for a long time is so significant. And most people don't know that is real and that exists here, you know, especially because of what the media chooses to show. After George Floyd was murdered and the uprising happened, media flooded in from not only around the country but around the world, and that in itself was was overwhelming. But you know, they really were picky about what they chose to cover and what events they went to. Even during that time, the people who have been trying to fix the policing problem and all kinds of things had been organizing events that were peaceful and amazing speakers. And even though the media was in town, a lot of them skipped those events. And then obviously, since that happened, we slowed down, I think, when it was colder outside. But even then, during the winter, there were still events happening. And at some points, it felt like it was just every day. There was even more than one thing to go to for different families, for different organizations. And it was just constant. And so like you said, Nick, I'm a photographer among many things. And one of my ways to sort of be involved and also give back to causes that I care about is to document them, and then here are photos of your thing, or to just help those events reach a wider audience by live streaming or posting the photos places. And I have since joined with some other local photojournalists into a group that's called Move for Justice News. And among all of us, we've literally covered everything that has happened since even before George Floyd was murdered, but everything from the uprising until now. There really hasn't been an event that we haven't made it to. And I just think it's so great that we were able to document that we can show the full story of what has been happening here, because it's just so important. So I put some photos together into a little slideshow to just show people a bit about what has been happening here that they probably didn't see. I started with some of the photos that were the kinds of things that were in the media, you know, the people recovering from getting tear gassed, people climbing on buildings, the things getting smashed and looted. Is these are the pictures that were the kinds of things that made it into the media. Also, these are the kinds of pictures that people click on and people end up looking at things like this more. But as soon as just a few days of this kind of stuff stopped, we started seeing people coming out into the community to clean up. We saw mutual aid start really quickly, where people were handing out, even just in the protests, they were handing out masks and hand sanitizer and water and food, and tables of all kinds of supplies were getting set up in all different neighborhoods across both of Minneapolis and St. Paul. For those not familiar, we have two different cities here that are right next to each other, so we're called the Twin Cities. And a lot of these events that happened, you can see there's just so many people came out to them, but not a lot of people came to document them and to show what was happening. This was Nekima, you can see yourself in this photo. This was in Minneapolis, one of the many protests to try to get Bob Kroll gone. And so many amazing speakers throughout the summer, so much joy, and even amongst the pain. And this is a picture of a mother whose son, Cordell Handy, was killed here in Minnesota. She lives in Chicago, and she travels up constantly to be with the other family members at their events. There's so much solidarity, and this was another event.
That was Kim Henry Jones, just for people who want to know.
Yes, thank you. We had an event for Summer Taylor, who was hit by a car and killed over the summer when she was protesting. We had a lot of events for people who hadn't necessarily had events before. I don't remember the name of this woman's father, but he was killed by police when she was young. And on her birthday, she decided to plan an event for him. So there was a march through downtown, and other family members that had experienced the loss of their family members due to police violence were there to support her. This one was for Kobe Heisler, who was also killed by police, and his family. You can see his mom and his stepdad and his dad are in this photo. But there's also mothers. There's a fiance. There's a wife. There's so many people that have come together that have experienced this horrible reality, but they've found each other, and they are continually organizing these events and showing solidarity and not stopping. When you were talking about the list of people that have been lost because of the police, I was thinking about these photos and this scroll that comes out at events sometimes, where we have the name, the age, and the date of people that were killed. And this scroll is it's huge. It's honestly, going through some of these photos to put them together for this slideshow was emotional, to look at all of this again and to look at that massive list. And so many of the names, even to those of us that have gone to these events for a long time, a lot of those names are still unfamiliar. There's just so many people. There's so many stories. This is Marilyn Hill. Her son, Demetrius, was killed back in the 90s by police. We recently had another event for him. This was last year, and I believe this was her first event that she ever organized. Back then, there wasn't this community, and there wasn't the ability to speak out and to have people support you through it. And now that exists, Marilyn has been doing that, and it's been really amazing, sad and hard to witness, but I am so happy that she's been able to have this community surround her and to help her through this. There's a photo of you and Marilyn hugging. And again, there's all of the families that they're always coming out and supporting each other, and it's amazing to see. It's so hard to witness, but it's amazing to see that we have that here. And I wish that was something that more people knew about and could just see from across the country. This was an event with Native Lives Matter. Billy Hughes was killed by police in St. Paul. And speaking of Native Lives Matter, there's so many different organizations here, and you can probably help me list some of them. There's Native Lives Matter. There's different Black Lives Matter for
there's BLM Twin Cities and BLM Minnesota, neither of which are affiliated with the national BLM, but they're local folks. Chantel Allen runs BLM Twin Cities and Satara Strong Allen. And then BLM Minnesota is run by Monique Cullors Doty, whose nephew, Marcus Golden, was killed by St. Paul police in January of 2015. And Trahern Cruz's nephew was left to die in Beltrami County Jail within the last couple of years, Hardell Sherrill. And his mom was in one of the photos, Delcia Perry, and she's been out there trying to bring attention to what's happening in the jails and prisons. People are being abused and dying, and there's no accountability. And like
And
you
that
said, Lives Matter, Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar, Communities United Against Police Brutality, Families Serving Families Against Police Violence, the Justice Coalition, and CARE Minnesota. There are plenty of others. Those are in the Racial Justice Network. A lot of our groups organize together. That's how we're able to hold so many events. And we collaborate and lift each other up as best we can.
And Emma, you brought something up that, we could talk about it later, but I think it's like such an untold part of the story, and would love to hear about it from you, Nekima, and you, Emma. And that is the role that the families play in leading the events, organizing the events, because that, I've heard so little about that in the media.
Well, I think it's also unusual to some degree in terms of the level of activism, ongoing activism of families, because much of the time, families are still grieving. They're still trying to make sense of what happened to their loved one. They're still trying to get answers from elected officials. And here, what we've seen is a robust level of activism amongst those families in terms of organizing events, collaborating with activists and organizers, which has been really, really powerful. And we've seen families find their voices, use their voices, and speak up and fight back on behalf of their loved ones. And so we have 8 bills right now that are pending at the legislature through the Minnesota Justice Coalition, mncoalition.org, if anybody wants to go see those bills. And the families helped to craft some of the language of the bills and some of the areas of focus within the bills, such as, for example, removing the current 3-year statute of limitations for families to file civil actions, and at a minimum allowing a 10-year statute of limitations, and then even a look back period for those earlier cases that never got any kind of real justice or accountability. They've been a part of that, as well as pushing for qualified immunity. Last year, the family of Kobe Heisler. Kobe was a 20-something-year-old young African-American man who was killed by the Brooklyn Center Police, and that's the same police department that killed Dante Wright recently. Kobe Heisler had autism. He had a mental health issue, and his grandparents called 911 because they thought he was going to hurt himself. They canceled the call. The police came anyway, and they wound up killing Kobe Heisler. And so his family was a part of pushing for legislation during the special session last year to try to bring forward more training for autism and mental health for police officers arriving on the scene. And of course, they've been more active since Dante Wright's killing and calling attention to the disparities within the Brooklyn Center Police Department, because they've killed 6 people since, I want to say, 2012, and 5 of the 6 have been people of color. So there is a systemic issue within the Brooklyn Center Police Department, and Kobe Heisler's family has stood alongside the family of Dante Wright in calling for accountability and a shift in terms of some of those practices. Go ahead.
Isn't it, there's no Brooklyn Center police officers that live in Brooklyn Center right now? Isn't that
what the mayor
true?
said? None of them live in Brooklyn Center. And even in Minneapolis, 92% of Minneapolis cops don't live in Minneapolis either, right? And the reason that is the case, there was a law called Stanek's Law by the former sheriff of Hennepin County, Rich Stanek. He was a legislator at one point, and he authored Stanek's Law, which removed the residency requirement for police officers. So we've had a huge shift since that time, where many of these officers don't live anywhere near the streets that they patrol. So they're coming in from white suburbs and exurbs and patrolling Black, brown, and indigenous communities and low-income people. And often they're using force. And when they're not using force, they're criminalizing people, they're harassing people, and they're undermining people's dignity. I want to draw attention to one of the women who's watching this, Zoya Code. She's an African-American woman. She was featured in the New York Times, and she talked about her experience in dealing with Derek Chauvin before he killed George Floyd, and how he almost killed her as well. So I want to thank her, first of all, because she's always tuning in. Shows up at protests. She's been using her voice. She's a mom. And for her to still be standing firm after what she went through. Her case received very little attention when it happened because people didn't know, about Derek Chauvin. They didn't take it seriously when she raised her concerns, but she literally, by the grace of God, is alive and able to tell her story, knowing what he just did to George Floyd. And so it's important to listen to Black women, to give space to the voices of Black women and Black men and Black children, because living in Minnesota we call it the Jim Crow North, because these things have been allowed to go on for so many years, and it's an open secret. How many times did we read in the paper about these disparities, about policing issues? And as Emma talked about, the way that they're framed, it's not in a good way towards how the victim is portrayed. It's usually looking for the number of commendations in an officer's file or trying to find a way to justify the killing. It's not balanced. There's no investigative journalism. And the media, mainstream media, in some ways have become the public relations arms of law enforcement agencies across the state of Minnesota. So we have to spend quite a bit of our time calling out mainstream media and trying to amplify the work and voices of independent media. That's how our stories have been able to be told.
In George Floyd's case, the original press release from the police was something about how we had asphyxiated, right? It was, something that had nothing to do with the original statement, right? That had nothing to do, like it said, it was just complete. It was just a lie, just a complete lie.
Yep, and the chief didn't know, right? So the way that I found out that this even happened on Memorial Day was I was tagged in a Facebook post by a woman named Ashley Quinones. You showed her picture earlier, Emma, with the other families who've lost loved ones to police violence. Ashley Quinones' husband, Brian Quinones, was killed by the Edina and Richfield police departments within the last, let's say, year and a half or so. And Ashley, of course, is involved in activism and helping to organize families. She founded a group called the Justice Squad. And when someone who lives close by, 38th in Chicago, told her what the police had done. So she tagged me in a Facebook post that day saying that Minneapolis police had choked someone or somehow crushed their throat and killed them. So I looked online, I didn't see anything. So I picked up the phone and I called Chief Arredondo. And I asked him if Minneapolis police had killed someone that night. And he said, no, not to his knowledge. From his understanding, someone had died of a medical emergency while being taken into custody. And I said, that's not what the community's saying. Have you seen video of this incident? He said, no. He said he had turned the case over to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to investigate. Now, they're not a trustworthy organization. And before Jamar Clark was killed, most policing agencies investigated their own killings. So when they would kill someone, it would be cops who worked alongside killer cops investigating them, which of course there's no real impartiality when that happens. And so when Jamar Clark was killed in 2015, we demanded an independent third-party investigation. And the mayor at that time, Betsy Hodges, decided to go and enlist the BCA. And we're like, they're not independent. These are still cops investigating cops, and they cover for cops. But that's what they did. And so after that, Minneapolis police has started to use the BCA to investigate their cases. And so the chief just kind of passed it along. He, believed what the cops had said. And I'm like, you need to see video for yourself. And so then I went to Facebook. I said, this is what people told Ashley. This is what the chief has said. We need to see video of what happened. And then Ashley tagged me in what is now known as the, video seen around the world 50 million times that Darnella Frazier captured, showing what really happened. And I saw that video, tears just started streaming down my face because I'm like, this is a lynching. So I called the chief back. I'm like, they killed that man. They killed, like, there's no question what we saw. And he saw the video himself and he was shocked. I'm like, you guys need to retract that press release immediately. And then we started calling for those officers to be fired and then charged. And like literally the rest is history.
That's incredible. It's incredible that even the police officers, Chauvin, the other cops that participated or stood by while Chauvin murdered George Floyd, were that they even deceived their own police chief, that they hadn't even told him, and it goes to show, like, there's so many levels at which there's a breakdown of information and so many people look the other way, and things like this just slide under the radar. And if there hadn't been that video, that's probably where it would have ended.
Absolutely. That is where it would have ended, because it's one thing to have a video as well. First of all, we got to commend 17-year-old, then 17-year-old Darnella Frazier for seeing what was happening, taking her little cousin to the front of Cup Foods to try to shield her from what was going on. And then she walked back and she kept a steady hand all that time as George Floyd was being killed, right? And so we have to commend her as a young woman for doing what she did when she could have, been a teenager and kept going and, thought it wasn't her business or trusted the police, which she did not do. But I think the other part about all of this as well is just the helplessness of bystanders, right? In situations like that. I've never heard anyone in any official capacity say that the bystanders had a physical right to intervene, that they could have done a citizen's arrest or they could have put their bodies on the line to protect George Floyd. Everyone knows that those bystanders not only would have been maced, they likely would have been beaten and or killed if they had physically intervened in that situation. And the narrative, despite what Derek Chauvin was doing to George Floyd, would have been completely different. And if we watched the trial, we already saw how they were trying to spin the narrative to make the bystanders the problem, right? So what do we do, in those situations as people witnessing murder, as young people witnessing murder and essentially being helpless from being able to do anything? So I have to commend all those bystanders and the people who did what they could do. But if it weren't for people paying attention, witnessing what was happening, documenting it, letting other people know, the world still might not know what happened to George Floyd. And the advent of social media, because there could be videos, and there have been videos. Remember in Eric Garner's case, the police came and they had actually been harassing and criminalizing the young man who filmed Eric Garner being killed in New York. And so sometimes those videos don't even see the light of day. But thankfully it was posted to social media. We've seen the BCA in the past. They have gone and collected people's videos. And that sometimes those videos are not returned or they're damaged or whatever. So people don't even see all the videos that actually come forward. So I'm glad she uploaded it to social media before the BCA commandeered that video.
Absolutely. Emma, were there other photos? I wonder if you wanted to take us through, because I know that you have ones spanning months.
Well, I went back to this one when you were talking, Nekima, just about the media perspective on stuff, that it's the big mainstream media outlets that fly in from across the world and, get their tiny perspective of something and run with it and don't tell the full story. But that even happens locally across the country too. And here, I believe I've been to maybe over the last year, like 3 different events that were focused on the media. And I have a photo of Tashira Garraway here. Her fiance and the father of her son was killed by police. And we're in front of KSTP to call out their reporting. There was a specific article that came out that was just wrong words, wrong perspective. I believe they didn't even retract something correctly, and to just put the pressure on in front of them. It was a very last minute planned thing, but a handful of people came out and there was a press conference in front. There was a march against the media last summer that started at the Star Tribune downtown and then went through downtown. I went to another one in St. Paul that stopped out in front of NPR and TPT, the local public television station here in the Twin Cities. So it's a mainstream problem too, but it's also local media also. And is it WCCO, the anchor who was married to Bob Kroll?
Yeah, who is married to Bob Kroll, Liz Collin. So the one you mentioned for the Star Tribune, they started at WCCO calling for Liz Collin to be fired because she had continued during the time she was dating Bob Kroll. She had continued covering policing issues and didn't disclose it until someone leaked that they had gotten married and they were in a relationship. So we held WCCO accountable for that. And then we marched to the Star Tribune and called them out as well for their crooked reporting when it comes to police killings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for those that don't know, Bob Kroll was the president of the Police Officers Federation, which is the union for the police officers. So there's, some assumptions that can be made if there's like a major news anchor that is married to that person, that might influence the coverage.
Absolutely.
Not a stretch to make there.
And you know how you showed one of those protests before outside of the Police Federation office?
Mm-hmm.
We were calling for Bob Kroll to step down, to be fired for his conduct. I mean, he was on stage with Trump, when Trump was in town. I mean, just horrible. He cast George Floyd as a villain, knowing the man was dead. And as he's done with many other people who've been killed by police. And I'm happy to say that in January, he resigned, he took a buyout or whatever, and he's now no longer a Minneapolis police officer, nor is he the head of the Minneapolis Police Federation. And I think that our activism and the pressure we applied upon him, upon his wife for her involvement, contributed to him leaving early. And no longer being a voice, that media pays attention to when it comes to these issues. We also went to his house in Hugo. That's a whole other situation, but that was definitely a powerful and effective demonstration.
I saw those photos too.
I think it's another example. We have so many now that organizing and keeping the pressure on and being in the streets, and that's just one piece of the puzzle here, but all of it matters, and it does have the potential to actually affect change. A lot of people will watch live streams of protests and they'll complain like, oh, do you have a job? Go home, whatever. But like this stuff it does actually matter when you do it well. And when you have a consistent message, when you have like the amazing speakers, yourself included, that we have. And this community has mattered so much. And that's why we got to celebrate in the streets with Guilty, Guilty, Guilty last month. That's why Bob Kroll doesn't have the same job anymore. And I'll go back to this photo. There's another situation that has happened more recently related to the police murder of Dante Wright. That was just absolutely absurd that this happened when the community was dealing with the Chauvin trial and knowing that the verdict was coming, and then another Black man was killed by police in the metro area. And just in itself, that is absolutely unacceptable and heartbreaking. But to have that happen at the time when all of these people that have been dealing with this sort of stuff are also processing and still dealing with the trial going on, that everything was boarded up. The National Guard was here. Everybody was on edge. And then this happened. But like we've said many times, the community here is amazing and doesn't stop and is constantly boots on the ground and has been out in the streets for Dante Wright. And this is a photo from Stillwater from the first time that a group has gone out to Pete Orpit's home, who is the Washington County attorney who is taking the case for Kimberly Potter, who's the officer that killed Dante Wright, and putting pressure on, because we've learned that works. So we've gone to his house and demanding murder charges against Kimberly Potter. And I guess, Nekima, do you want to say a little bit about the other thing that happened in Stillwater? Because
Stillwater has been an interesting place. So we went, as Emma said, we went the first time, I want to say it was a few weeks ago. And then we also went back on the day of Dante Wright's funeral. with Pete Orpin living in Stillwater, he lives roughly 40 minutes away from where Dante Wright was killed. And he shouldn't even be bringing charges in this case because he does not have a sense of what actually happens in the metro area to people of color. But the county attorneys metro-wide have some kind of pact where if they think there's a conflict of interest, they can assign a different county attorney to take the case. And so Mike Freeman, who was a whole mess all by himself, he's a Hennepin County attorney, he agreed for Pete Orpin to take on this case. So we've had to drive all the way to Stillwater in front of his home. The first time we were there for the picture that Emma showed, we held a demonstration, we marched, and then one of our partners, Jaylani Hussein, was still out there in front of Pete's home while we were on the march. Pete came out apologizing to his neighbors, thinking we were gone. And Jaylani was like, wait a minute, he should be apologizing to me as a Black man. So he engaged him, and then I went up and engaged him. Pete was making a bunch of excuses. That was the first time. The second time we went, and actually during our march, there was a man named Earl Shem who got very enraged, wouldn't move his car, got out of his car, very angrily, and the police essentially hemmed him up and, put his hands behind his back, moved him out of the way, moved his car out of the way. So then the second time when we came back, there was a white man who was friends with that first guy, Earl, and the white man, Paul Gorder, was out there basically saying F you, throwing finger signs at us. He had on a Punisher t-shirt. He had a blue mask type thing around his mouth. And he was just out of control. And then, interestingly, one of the people who came to speak was Mayan Burrell. Mayan Burrell, for those who may not know, was a young African-American man. He was a teenager who wound up going to prison for a murder he did not commit. And Amy Klobuchar was the Hennepin County attorney at the time. She used this case to help ascend to higher offices and even tried to use this case on the campaign trail when she was running for president. So the Associated Press did a year-long investigation into his case that came out in the spring of last year when she was running for president. And basically, as activists and organizers, we came alongside Mayan Burrell's family and we fought for him to be released. He got released miraculously on December 15th of 2020. And Amy Klobuchar, as you all know, she dropped out of the race, et cetera. But her involvement in the case is still something that we pay attention to and that we call out when we need to. So at Dante Wright's funeral, Amy Klobuchar actually was on stage speaking, which to me was an abomination. Like, you have no business speaking in front of a Black church after what you did. You haven't even apologized to this man. So I called Mayan Burrell when I left the funeral, and I just told him how upset I was, seeing what was happening. So he said, I'm going to come with you guys. I'm going to meet you in Stillwater. So he came, and this was his first time speaking out. He started speaking, and the next thing you know, as he's talking, he says, oh, hey, Paul. And he's waving to the guy who's cursing us out with the Punisher t-shirt and the mask. And we're like, you know him? And Mayan's like, yeah, he's a correctional officer. So they hugged. As you can see, we were shocked. We didn't even know what to make of the situation. But Mayan said he was humane. So we gave him the benefit of the doubt. We're just like, he wasn't acting like this before you came, Mayan. The police had gotten closer to our demonstration because they thought the guy was going to attack us. And so, to make a long story short, we just kind of, left him alone. He was drunk. We're just like, dude, just get away from us. Treat Black people with dignity. And we left. The third time we came to Pete's house, which was about a week and a half ago, we had Sunday church service there. So we literally brought chairs, we brought a podium, we brought the mothers brought a Bible, we had praise and worship, we had real preaching, we had it all right in front of Pete Orpin's home. And that guy's wife, Paul Gorder's wife, her name is Kimberly as well, she wound up trying to get into a protester's car, thinking it was her car. They were both drunk, and people told her, that's not your car, first of all. Second of all, you shouldn't be driving drunk. And that's when she said, get out of here, you effing N-words. And she just basically used a racial slur, cursed us out, and the police had to intervene. And so one of the young people, actually the son of Kim Handy Jones, who you showed earlier, Emma, whose son Cordell had been killed, her other son, Isaiah, captured it all on video. And he showed me the video that evening when we got back to my house. And so we uploaded it, and the DOC responded, because Paul Gorder is like a 26 to 30-year veteran correctional officer. And the DOC said they're investigating, which they are, regarding what he did, his conduct. Kim, his wife, was fired from Fantastic Sam's in Maplewood. We also had called out the twins for Earl Shim, who works there, and his behavior. So at a minimum, I'm expecting to see some kind of response from the Department of Corrections regarding Paul Gorder's behavior and his violence, his verbal violence, he and his wife, towards peaceful demonstrators.
You brought up a number of different forms of action, and really creative ones, that seem to be really effective, like getting Bob Kroll to resign and to leave. And also, I would say, absolutely contributing to the verdict in the Chauvin trial. Without all the actions, the pressure, everything that happened, it definitely seems like he would have got off. He would have been, just another one of the cops, white cops, predominantly, that gets off for killing Black men or women. And so I wonder, I think there's probably a lot of people watching. Among our members at the People's Party, we have a philosophy that is both, we try to work on electoral races. And so we're running for Congress. We're going to run for Congress, a number of different districts across the country. But at the same time, we believe that just the electoral work isn't enough. We also believe that you have to do direct action. You have to do movement building. And so we have that kind of joint, electoral movement philosophy. And I think there's a lot of people, one of our main working groups on the national level and across the country, in the states and hubs as well, is action dedicated specifically to planning things like that. And so I think there's a lot of people who'd be really interested to hear in the variety of different kinds of actions that you've used to actually be able to push public officials, whether it's the legislature, whether it's police, into doing things that they didn't want to do. You mentioned some earlier, like, taking the streets, going to people's homes. Going to people's homes was very successful for us last summer. We did it to a number of members of Congress, and learned that the fastest way to get a member of Congress to meet with you is to go to their home, because they hate it. And so,
your neighbors hate it.
Yeah, there's people around the country who could benefit from what you've learned and from what you've done, like as far as direct action, when they're looking to apply that kind of pressure locally.
Well, there's a lot that people can do. I love Zoya Coates' comment. When you first started talking about direct action, she says, "Nah, I was on that ass." And basically, I think she's talking about her calling out Derek Chauvin as one of the things in, like, the practices, the abusive practices of the Minneapolis Police Department. So that's part of it, right? Speaking truth to power and being consistent in that. And so sometimes that might mean doing an interview with a mainstream news outlet, doing interviews with independent news outlets, going on social media. I use my own Facebook Live a lot to share with people and try to educate people and bring people along, because we are probably going to have some kind of call to action, which might mean emailing or calling elected officials or otherwise applying pressure or showing up somewhere. We've held demonstrations, across the Twin Cities and even outstate Minnesota. So the action I mentioned earlier, where Hardell Sherrill he died in Beltrami County Jail unnecessarily. His mother, Delshia Perry, organized an action in Beltrami County, 4 hours away. So people hopped on a bus or they drove, and we went from the Twin Cities to Beltrami County and had a demonstration there. We did a die-in outside of the jail. People gave speeches. So activism is whatever you want it to be, right? So we do our best to have peaceful demonstrations, But we let elected officials know we can't control what happens at a protest. All we can do is be as organized as possible. But it's their inaction and their neglect of the people that invite people to take to the streets. And it's like, whatever happens, it's your responsibility because you did not work to preempt, a tragedy from happening. So, Diane's, of course, we've shut down freeways. Some of us are facing charges right now. I'm one of 646 people who was charged for a demonstration on I-94 in November, the day after the presidential election. And we were saying, don't let Donald Trump steal the election. We were talking about policing and all kinds of things. And the police kettled us on the freeway for 5 hours. And so we are still facing those charges. So that sometimes comes with the territory of being involved in a demonstration. So people should count the costs before they get out there and know that sometimes you can get arrested, you can be charged, and people have to figure out what level of risk they can absorb. Not to mention, of course, you're out there, we're still in a pandemic. People are still being vaccinated or deciding not to. So, we do our best to wear masks and continue washing our hands to protect ourselves. But we have definitely shown up at people's homes. And there's, of course, a lot of criticism that is associated with that. But in light of the pandemic, the home is the new office. And most office buildings are closed. You got to go somewhere. Just like they come knock on our doors, why can't we come knock on their doors?
Well, and these tragedies come to our home. Like, when George Floyd, Dante Wright, when people like that are killed by police, is it, as if that doesn't affect the families, as if that doesn't come to the homes of the families and the people who are affected in the communities? You can't draw this neat line where you keep that outside of the homes of not just the families, but everybody in the city. And so the idea that you wouldn't go actually apply pressure at their homes, bring it to their homes as well, to me, it seems only just. It seems only just that people would have to face the consequences of their actions and not be able to retreat from that, even when they go home.
Absolutely.
These are public officials who are supposed to be accountable to us. And if they were doing their job, then none of this would be happening in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Right. We're uncomfortable, so they need to be uncomfortable. Right. Our peace and safety is disrupted. So they need to feel that sense of disruption in the comfort of their homes. Because if you look at Dante Wright, the man was minding his own business, driving along, when police decided to disrupt his day and abruptly end his life. Like, these are things that we can't take lightly or for granted that happen to people on a regular basis. And the reason that they're allowed to happen is because too many of us sit on the sidelines or remain silent, or we think that it's somebody else's responsibility. When the truth is, we helped elect these people. And so now we have to show up and hold them accountable, even if it's knocking on their doors or having church in the street in front of their home. I want to make sure Emma weighs in, on all of this as well.
I loved that church service in the street.
It was a real church service, wasn't it?
It was real. It was real. It wasn't like it wasn't a stunt. It was a real church service. And that made it that much weirder to have that experience with Paul after all of that,
well, it brought the demonic spirits to the surface and exposed them, right? That's what it did. And that was part of our prayer.
That's true. It was interesting. It was, you guys were saying one thing and then it was like an instant moment. And then again, results right away. Like, as soon as people figured out who this guy was and started tweeting, talking about his name and stuff, the Department of Corrections was like, oh, hey, and had to say something. So something happens, do something about it, and something will happen. It might not always go your way, but it's better than doing nothing and just sitting at home and complaining. But when you guys were talking about bringing stuff to people's doorsteps, it kind of made me think of the sort of the wider picture of just not just in our society, in our country, but a lot of people are this way, that they just don't care about things until it's on their doorstep. Like, I'm an anti-war activist. I care a lot about imperialism and like war happening across the world. a lot of people don't, because it doesn't affect them directly. It's not on their doorstep. They don't see it, so they don't feel it, and they don't care. And that's what we see on so many issues at home too, that the community who is dealing with a person that, you know, maybe wasn't somebody that they know, but maybe it was somebody that lived in their neighborhood, or it happened in their neighborhood and there was a murder. It came to their doorstep. They're caring. They're going to be out in the street. They want things to change. They don't want that reality in front of them. But then you've got these people who are the elected officials who are making the rules and calling the shots that don't live in these communities. So they don't have this stress and this emotion and this fear and this sadness on their doorsteps. So taking it to their doorstep, taking it to them, makes them pay attention to it. You know, they can close the shades and they can like turn on music so they don't hear that it's happening, but it's happening and their neighbors know that it's happening. So that's a tool. And yeah, of course it's not pleasant, but if you do your job, it's not going to happen. If you're doing it the right way, maybe we will come to your front door, but it'll be a party because we're happy. You know, it doesn't have to be this way. But I've just, you know, it's unfortunate because all of this is rooted in so much sadness and in the way this shouldn't be the way that it is, but seeing the way that it's brought people together and caused change is so encouraging and amazing to witness. And we just seem to be on the track that it's just we're gonna keep making the change in the right direction, and then the times that we get together in front of people's houses will be for good things and celebrations.
Could you talk a bit more about that, Emma? I think that's another thing that people would be fascinated to hear about is, you know, the primary demands that you've had of the city, of the state, of the national legislature, you know, the national leadership, Biden, and how they're doing on those.
You know, one of my favorite things about a lot of the events that I go to here locally, especially Jaylani with CARE, Minnesota, is that people bring up imperialism and bring up the fact that Republicans and Democrats don't have everybody's back here. They're not doing, you know, they appear a little bit differently out front. They'll say different things, but there's a track record here of the Democrats doing certain things and saying certain things just to get the vote, and then they're done. And that's been a topic that's been pretty consistent at a lot of the recent events. And I personally, you know, because I'm here working with the People's Party, I'm not a two-party duopoly like supporter. I think we need something else for a whole heck of a lot of reasons. And I'm personally happy to see that conversation is happening also here. I'm wondering if anybody needs to get going though, because we've been about an hour now. Or we can keep talking.
Take a few more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I would love to hear from you, Nekima, then some of those demands that you've had of the city and nationally and of the state. And do you think that any of them, you know, are you confident that any of them are going to be implemented in the end? What do you think is going to change out of this, you know, as far as like concrete laws and policies?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it's important for people to know that through our activism and demands for change, we've helped oust a mayor, we've helped oust the previous police chief. And the current chief is the one who made the decision to swiftly fire all 4 officers, which was unprecedented. Mm-hmm. We also saw that he testified at the trial and stated unequivocally that, you know, what Chauvin did was not departmental policy. He claimed it wasn't part of their values. I'm gonna leave that alone because, you know, from my perspective, what he did, unfortunately, is a reflection of the Minneapolis Police Department. But one of the jurors who I interviewed last week, Brandon Mitchell, talked about how surprised he was to hear the chief testifying and that it did have an impact on him. as he was listening to the testimony that came forward. So I think that that's a different type of leadership. You know, even though he is a part of a racist system, he is going to take a long time to overhaul what's happening within MPD because the racism is so deeply entrenched. But I do have to commend the people for standing up and pushing for those leadership changes. We have seen some policy changes begin to happen in terms of like some of the policies surrounding body cameras when they need to be turned on. Also the new sanctity of life policy that didn't exist before. I feel that we have stronger input in terms of pushing for investigations compared to how things were in the past. We saw some watered down bills that happened in the last legislative session, and there's some momentum being built. This time around is still not enough, considering that other jurisdictions have, you know, like New York City became the first city to end qualified immunity. State of Maryland overturned their police bill of rights. We're saying these things should be happening here in the place where George Floyd was killed. Beyond that, I think that, you know, we have people running for office in the next city election. And hopefully some of those folks with new energy who care about people will get into those seats and actually become decision makers. Contrary to many people's belief, you know, in terms of thinking our city council's progressive, they're not. We went to them many, many times before George Floyd was killed. And we put some very specific demands on the table that they had the power to implement, and they did absolutely nothing. So to suddenly go out to Powderhorn Park in June after George Floyd was killed and announce they're going to dismantle MPD, it was really to look progressive. It was for the cameras. It was not a part of a sincere effort to address the underlying concerns that we have in our community. So I think that this is a turning point. The fact that one officer so far has been found guilty, the fact that there are 4 more cops now in the pipeline who could also potentially be found guilty for killing Black people, it means that a shift is happening. But in order for it to be brought all the way to fruition in terms of the changes we're seeking, it's going to take people continuing to help apply pressure. And that's in whatever lane that people are in, whether it's writing op-eds, whether it's picking up the phone and calling elected officials or emailing them, or influencing your network or your church or your social circle, or calling out racist relatives. I mean, it's going to take all those things in order for more change to happen in the way that we want it to happen more rapidly. I don't think it should take 20 or 30 years to see the kind of changes we're seeking. They're very possible to do. The political will needs to be there. And probably most importantly, the power of the people needs to be there.
Definitely. Yeah. I put in, I'm going to share it real quick. I put a link because you talked about this earlier, but we've had probably some people leave and join us since then. The website for the Minnesota Coalition that has the list of the 2021 legislative demands that are all really important. And like you explained before, the family was involved in them. And then, so there's more information for anybody that wants to learn more about those here.
Thank you for sharing that, Emma. And so, Emma, is there anything that we wanted to say in closing?
Just thank you for joining us. Like I've explained quite a few times, I've witnessed so much happen in the last year, and I know that the majority of the people around the country haven't, for the reasons that mainstream media doesn't show stuff. And it's important to know, and to know that it, because of all this stuff happened, the community organizing, the people with their boots on the ground, that's why change is happening, because people are being active and people are keeping the pressure on, and how important that is, and to encourage people around the country that this is still happening. You know, people have such a skewed understanding of what happened here over the summer and for the last year. You know, like a lot of people think that literally all of Minneapolis burned. You know, I'll like live stream something now and some of the comments are like, oh wow, there's buildings. Like, okay. Some things burnt. The whole thing didn't burn down. And that whole stunt that happened with the city council over the summer, great photo opportunity there with the abolish the police and the big letters in front. And that went that went everywhere. And there's a lot of people think that now in Minneapolis there are no police. There's like that thing, that event, the things that they said in those photos. There are actually people that exist right now that think that the police did get abolished here, and they don't know the truth. You know, they'll see a crime and they're like, well, that's because you got rid of the police in Minneapolis. No, that actually they're funding them more. they didn't.
Incredible.
So I think it's just important, in light of the verdict with the Chauvin trial, but even outside of that, to just keep people around the country aware of what's happening here, especially here, because we've had all of these organizations that have existed for a long time. Like, this isn't new. Communities United Against Police Brutality, people trying to get community control of the police. Like, people have been doing this for years, for a very, very long time. A lot of people think that this is a newer issue, that people are finally just like waking up and paying attention and trying to make change. But people have been doing this for a very long time. It's just that more people are finally paying attention to it. But just the potential for the Twin Cities to be an example because of the uprising over the summer spreading across the country and across the world. I think it's important for people to continue to know what's happening here, what the people with their boots on the ground are doing and what they've been doing for years, and to encourage other people across the country to take a look at this list on the Minnesota Coalition website and like try to get those things to happen where you live too. You know, it takes people to do this stuff. So power to the people, go out and do the stuff.
Get it done. It does have an influence. It doesn't have an impact. And Minneapolis led the country and it led the world in a racial justice uprising. And it's people, it's people like you both who led Minneapolis in doing that, and who's just like unbelievably tireless activism. I know as someone who does a lot of activism in Washington, D.C., who make those things happen. And so just tremendous respect to both of you. And Nekima, I hope that you run again one day, because it seems like the city could use better leadership. And Nekima, if you want to tell people where to find you too, please do.
Sure. So I do a lot of posts on my Facebook page. That's probably the main method of communication. I'm on Instagram as Nekima L, Nekimal. I'm on Twitter as NV Levy. So please feel free to send me a request or follow my work, and get involved. You can get involved from wherever you sit. There's change that needs to happen everywhere. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today and being part of this discussion. I want to thank Zoya for chiming in as well and sharing her perspective. Go read her story in the New York Times to learn about what she has gone through and lift her up, and her children as she continues to stand. I want to lift up all the families, send a happy birthday to Tashira Garraway, who's having a celebration this evening for her birthday, and also lifting up her fiance. But all the families who are out there with us, all the activists and organizers, and all those standing in solidarity with us, you are making a difference. So let's keep going. Let's keep going till our change comes. Thank you for having me tonight.
Let's make it happen. All right, Nekima and Emma, it's been great talking to you and great talking to everyone else out there. And we will catch you on the next episode. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye, everybody.